The fluorescent lights hummed their fluorescent hum when Margaret Walsh pushed through the staff entrance of Mercy General at 11:13 p.m., her silver hair pulled back in the same braid she'd worn for 7 years on night shift. The parking lot had been empty, just her Camry and 3 others scattered like forgotten things across the asphalt. She'd clocked in before anyone noticed her, the way she always did. No fanfare. No conversation. Just the soft beep of her badge against the time terminal and the walk to the break room, where the coffee pot gurgled its last few drops into a glass carafe that never quite got clean. The break room smelled like burnt caffeine and the ghost of someone's leftover lunch from 3 days ago. Margaret poured what remained into a ceramic mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters, a gift from a patient's family 3 years back, before the hospital started tracking minutes and discharge codes like they were inventory. The coffee was lukewarm already, the kind of temperature that meant nobody else was coming back for it. Good. That was good. She'd been there 2 minutes when the younger nurses arrived, the ones from day shift doing hand-off briefings, their scrubs still crisp, their voices still holding that afternoon energy. They moved through the break room in a cluster, their laughter preceding them like a weather system. Kayla from pediatrics. Marcus from cardiac. Jennifer, who always brought those protein boxes and ate them with mechanical precision while scrolling her phone. They saw her. Or they didn't. It amounted to the same thing. Margaret sat at the corner table with her cooling coffee, and she watched the choreography unfold with the kind of awareness that came from 1,000 nights of the same dance. The cluster migrated toward the center table, pulling chairs, settling in with their bags and phones and the ease of people who belonged in a room together. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. That would have required acknowledgement. This was something quieter. This was the sound of a table left behind, a periphery accepted without comment or question. She'd heard the statistics. They published them in the hospital newsletter. Night shift nurses had a tenure of 4 years on average. She was at 7. The articles called it dedication. What they meant was aberration. Margaret raised the mug to her lips and tasted burnt ground settling at the bottom. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away from the chart in her other hand, room 304, the Army Ranger with the pneumothorax that the attending had stabilized but never quite resolved. The oxygen saturation hovered at 88 on supplemental, which was acceptable, which was the kind of word that made her jaw tighten because acceptable wasn't the same as good, and good wasn't the same as safe. The Ranger's name was Marcus Webb. 32 years old. Service-related disability documentation in his file marked him as low discharge priority, which meant the hospital ran his care on margins instead of margins plus caution. She'd seen his mother yesterday, a Maria Webb, sitting in the visitor's chair with her hands folded like she was praying without moving her lips. The kind of woman who understood her son's body better than any chart could convey. Margaret had made eye contact with her for exactly 3 seconds. It was enough. Maria had understood, I will watch him. The footsteps in the corridor were precise, professional, expensive. Dr. Raymond Hargrove moved through the hospital the way a man moves through property he owns, each step a claim. His shoes clicked against the linoleum with the sound of Italian leather and confidence that had never been tested by anything that mattered. Margaret glanced up from the chart just long enough to register his arrival. His lab coat was pristine. His stethoscope hung like a credential. His expression suggested he was counting something in his head and finding the number unsatisfactory. Margaret, he said, and it wasn't a greeting. It was the kind of utterance a man makes when he's practicing saying someone's name without meaning it. Still running the night shift like it's a nursing home. The younger nurses laughed, the automatic laughter of people protecting their position in a hierarchy they understood. Jennifer looked at her phone. Marcus stopped mid-bite of a protein box. Kayla studied the microwave with sudden intensity. Margaret didn't set down the coffee. Didn't meet his eyes. Didn't change the angle of her jaw. She turned a page on the chart, room 305, diabetic admitted for medication adjustment, straightforward, low risk, and continued reading. I asked you a question, Hargrove said, and there was something in his voice now, the edge that came when someone discovered their authority wasn't generating the response they required. He was standing 3 feet from her table. She could smell his cologne, something aggressive and pharmaceutical, like someone had bottled the scent of arrogance. Night shift covers 2,847 patient encounters monthly, Margaret said, still reading. Her voice was flat, the kind of flat that comes from somewhere deeper than politeness. 84% fewer readmissions than day shift. 7 years. No complaints in my file. Hargrove smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd just discovered the lever he needed. Outdated protocols, he said. You're running this unit like it's still 2005. These patients need to move. They need bed turnover. They need to understand that hospital resources aren't a luxury. She turned another page. Room 306. Room 307. She kept her hand steady on the chart the way a pilot keeps hand steady on a yoke when the engine catches fire, automatic, measured, the opposite of the trembling that was happening somewhere deeper, somewhere she kept locked away. Some of these patients, Margaret said, aren't stable enough to move. Define stable, Hargrove said, and now he was leaning against the break room counter, the posture of a man settling in for an argument he believed he'd already won. Because from where I'm sitting, your definitions are costing this hospital about $40,000 a month in extended stays. And that's just the Medicaid cases. Your Medicaid patients stay longer, recover more slowly, and your insistence on keeping them here is, he paused, searching for the word. Well, it's not modern medicine. It's old medicine. It's mercy, maybe, but it's not business. The younger nurses had stopped their micro-movements. Even Jennifer had looked up from her phone. The silence in the break room was the kind of silence that precedes something. Margaret could feel it the way you feel a pressure change before a storm rolls in. She set down her coffee mug on the chart, deliberately, the ceramic making contact with the cardstock in a way that sounded like a period at the end of a sentence. Then she looked directly at him. Her eyes were the color of slate water, and they held something in them that made Hargrove's smile falter for exactly 1/4 of a second. I'll review the protocols, she said. It wasn't an agreement. It wasn't acquiescence. It was the kind of statement that left no room for argument because it didn't offer one. Hargrove straightened, registered the dismissal, and moved toward the door. His shoes clicked away down the corridor, the sound diminishing toward the attending station. The younger nurses returned to their phones, their conversations, their clustering. The pressure in the room eased. And Margaret sat alone with lukewarm coffee and a chart for a young man who was stable, who was acceptable, who was exactly the kind of patient who taught you what the difference was. But that wasn't the worst part. At 2:27 a.m., when the hospital had settled into the particular quiet of night shift, that low hum of machinery and distant monitors, the fluorescent lights casting everything in the color of sleeplessness, Margaret made rounds on room 304. The ranger was asleep, or pretending to be, his chest rising and falling with the shallow precision of someone managing pain without complaint. His oxygen mask was positioned correctly. His fall line was patent. His chest tube was draining clear fluid, which was good, which was what they wanted. But beside his bed, on the nightstand next to a water pitcher and a plastic cup, sat a pair of worn combat boots. They were army-issue, desert tan, the kind of footwear that survives places civilians don't have names for. The leather was cracked from heat and time. The sole on the right boot was worn thin on the outer edge, the gait signature of someone who'd compensated for an injury, probably left knee, probably chronic. The laces were new. Somebody had replaced them. The boots had been cared for the way soldiers care for things that remind them they survived. Margaret stood in the doorway for 3 seconds too long. Her hand gripped the doorframe. She didn't grip it hard. She gripped it the way a pilot grips the yoke when something in the cockpit just shifted, and he needs a moment to determine whether it was turbulence or something worse. The ranger's mother was asleep in the visitor's chair, her head tilted back at an angle that would make her neck hurt when she woke. Her face held the softness of sleep, but underneath was the permanent tension of someone who'd been afraid for a very long time. Margaret stepped into the room and checked the monitor without making sound. Room 304 was part of her rotation, part of her night, part of her job. She moved with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 8,000 times, or maybe 10,000, or maybe so many times that the number stopped meaning anything. She adjusted the oxygen flow slightly, a fraction of a liter, nothing worth noting, and checked the foredressing. It was dry. Intact. No signs of infiltration. And then, because she was thorough, because she was the kind of nurse who noticed things and kept them in a locked part of her mind where they couldn't hurt anyone, she glanced at the chart clip to the bed rail. Marcus Webb. 32. Army Ranger. Service-related disability. Next of kin, Maria Webb, mother. Previous occupation listed as security contractor. Kandahar, 2006 to 2008. Prior to service member status. Prior to. She closed the chart and stepped back into the corridor. The night stretched ahead of her with its fluorescent hum and its quiet vitality, the way hospitals breathe at 3 a.m., and Margaret Walsh moved through it with the kind of invisible competence that earned her nods from patients but nothing else, because nobody was watching closely enough to understand that the steadiness in her hands, the precision in her movements, and the particular quality of her stillness when she touched a patient, all of it came from somewhere much deeper than nursing school. Much older than 7 years, much more distant than any file they'd kept. The night had worn Margaret thin by 0200, the way hospitals do, not through violence or crisis, but through the accumulation of small indignities that pile up like 4 bags in a Sharps container. She'd checked on room 304 twice since the shift started, watching the ranger's oxygen saturation hover at a respectable 94%, his mother asleep in the visitor's chair with her head tilted at an angle that would punish her neck come morning. The boots sat exactly where he'd placed them, leather-creased from use that no amount of polishing could erase, and Margaret had learned not to look at them directly, the way you learn not to touch a fresh scar. She was reviewing the medication log at the nurse's station when Dr. Hargrove appeared beside her, his white coat still crisp at this ungodly hour, his tie knotted with the precision of someone who'd never once questioned his own importance. The station hummed with the fluorescent persistence of 2 a.m., the kind of lighting that made everything look slightly unreal, slightly wrong. Nurse Walsh. Not a greeting. An announcement. We need to discuss room 304. Margaret set down her pen with deliberate care. His vitals are stable, doctor. His insurance classification is what matters. Hargrove's voice began to climb, not yet a shout but climbing toward it with the confidence of a man who'd never been told to lower it. That bed is occupied by a Medicaid patient with a pneumothorax that's been managed. We have private insurance admissions waiting in the ER. 3 of them. 1 is a coronary bypass candidate with United Healthcare Gold. This is not a charity ward. The words carried. Margaret knew they would. She'd seen the way sound traveled through these corridors, how a voice raised at the nurse's station could echo down to room 304 like a stone dropped into still water. She didn't turn around to verify that the ranger's mother had heard it. She didn't need to. She could feel the shift in the air pressure, the way a room changes when someone's heart is breaking audibly. The patient's oxygen saturation dropped to 89% during his last turn, Margaret said quietly. The radiograph shows fluid reaccumulation. Discharge would be premature. Your job is to follow discharge protocols, not rewrite them. Hargrove's face had begun the familiar darkening that Margaret had learned to read like a vital sign. This is exactly what I'm talking about, dinosaur nurses who don't understand modern hospital economics. Patient flow metrics. Bed turnover. You think we're running a charity ward, but we're running a business. Your generation was trained to think medicine is about compassion. It's about throughput. He said it loud enough that everyone within 20 feet stopped pretending not to listen. The nursing assistant froze mid-scroll on her phone. The resident who'd been entering orders looked up from her laptop. The unit clerk's fingers stilled above the keyboard. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful, it was the silence of witnesses, the particular quiet that descends when someone has just been publicly dismantled. From room 304, Margaret heard the sound she'd been waiting for, the soft, broken intake of breath that came from a mother who'd heard every word. I'll prepare the discharge paperwork, Margaret said. She stood, and in the standing something shifted in her posture, not visible to anyone untrained in reading bodies, but they're nonetheless. A straightening of the spine. A slight drop in her center of gravity. The kind of adjustment someone makes when they're about to do something that will cost them. Hargrove's expression flickered, just for a moment. He'd expected capitulation. What he got instead was eye contact so steady and unreactive it made his own gaze slide sideways like a compass needle losing magnetic north. "That man in room 304 has the same right to live as any patient you've ever treated," Margaret said. Her voice was quiet enough that it barely traveled, which made it somehow more devastating than anything louder. "His oxygen saturation is dropping. His pleural fluid is reaccumulating. Discharging him in his current state violates basic standards of care. And I won't do it." Hargrove's face went from darkened to florid, the color of a man discovering his authority had just been challenged in front of witnesses. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Then he turned and walked toward his office, his pace slightly faster than normal, the pace of someone who'd just remembered he had phone calls to make. Margaret sat back down. Picked up her pen. Her hand was steady. The slight pressure she felt behind her sternum wasn't fear, it was recognition. She'd just crossed a line, and the crossing had felt like muscle memory, like her body remembering something her mind had spent 20 years forgetting. She gave Hargrove 5 minutes. Then she walked to room 304. The ranger's mother was standing at the window, her shoulders curved inward like a question mark, and she turned as Margaret entered. Her eyes were raw from crying, the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been breaking quietly for hours. "I heard what you said," the mother whispered. "Your son needs to stay admitted," Margaret said. "His condition is unstable. I'm going to monitor him closely. If Dr. Hargrove pushes the discharge again, I'm going to escalate to the patient advocate and the chief medical officer. This is not protocol, this is patient safety. You have my word." The mother reached out and gripped Margaret's hand. Her grip was fierce and desperate, the way drowning people grip anything solid. Margaret let her hold on. She didn't pull away. She waited until the woman's breathing had steadied, then she extracted her hand gently and stepped back into the corridor. The break room was exactly where she'd expected to find isolation. She poured coffee from the pot that had been sitting on the burner since 2100, the liquid the color of weak tea, and she sat at the table by the window where nobody else ever sat because it faced the parking lot instead of the interior of the hospital. Outside, Houston sprawled beneath sodium vapor lights, indifferent to the small wars being fought inside its medical centers. She was alone for 30 seconds before the first nursing assistant arrived, saw her, and pivoted toward a different table. Then a resident wandered in, grabbed ice water without looking at her, and left. Then another nurse, one of the ones from orientation who'd been hired after Margaret, who probably knew her name was Margaret because she'd been in orientation the same week, grabbed her lunch from the refrigerator and carried it to the far side of the break room, where 3 other staff members suddenly became very interested in the content of her meal prep containers. The silence in that room was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of professional exile, of the moment when a unit decides one of its own has committed the unforgivable offense of integrity. Margaret drank her coffee. It tasted like every other terrible hospital break room coffee she'd drunk for 7 years, burnt and hollow and somehow still warm. She was finishing the cup when the nursing assistant who'd been at the front desk appeared in the doorway. The young woman avoided Margaret's eyes entirely, which was its own kind of answer, and she walked directly to the bulletin board mounted on the break room wall where the time clock was located. Margaret could see her own name from where she sat today. She got up and walked to the board. The write-up was printed in Arial font, size 11, the bureaucratic standardization of institutional aggression. It read, "Disciplinary action, failure to follow discharge protocols and creating barriers to patient flow, Nurse M. Walsh, date, 0247 hours, patient safety concerns regarding non-compliance with established discharge criteria and resistance to departmental efficiency metrics. This constitutes insubordination and is subject to escalation." There was a signature line already signed. Dr. Hargrove had written his name with the aggressive downward slant of someone using a pen as a weapon. Margaret read it twice. Then she went back to her empty coffee cup and waited. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 0300 when she was in the ranger's room checking his oxygen saturation, 92% now, trending downward, and she caught sight of Dr. Hargrove through the window of his office, phone pressed to his ear, and something about the angle of his body, the way he was writing notes on a pad, the particular expression of satisfaction on his face, told her that he wasn't done. He was just getting started. The phone calls were beginning. Calls to people who owed him favors, calls to allies in the system, calls to people who could make a nurse's career go sideways with a single reference to the right person in the right administrative office. She lowered the bed railing and checked the ranger's foresight. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, unfocused, then closed again. His mother was asleep now, her head finally resting against the back of the chair, her breathing deep and broken by the occasional tremor of residual tears. Margaret stood there for a long moment, looking at those boots. Really looking at them. The stitching along the heel. The creases in the leather. The dust still embedded in the treads, dust that might have come from 1,000 places but that she recognized as Kandahar dust, the particular ochre color of earth that had been turned to powder by decades of war and wind. She'd thought she'd buried that person. The person who knew how to look at a young man in a hospital bed and see not a patient but a ghost from a life that had supposedly ended 20 years ago in a file room at Langley. She'd been wrong. For in the morning, Margaret stood at the nurse's station with the ranger's chart open like a prayer she couldn't quite remember. 7 hours into her shift and the numbers were moving the wrong direction. Oxygen saturation at 94 when she documented 97 at midnight. Respiratory rate climbing from 18 to 22. The kind of slow deterioration that didn't trigger alarms but triggered instinct, the same instinct that had kept her alive in places where the difference between noticing and not noticing was the difference between breathing and bleeding out on a hillside in Kandahar. She'd already called the attending physician twice. First at 0100 when the sat began its creep downward. Then again at 0330 when she'd watched the ranger shift position in bed and wince, his hand moving to his left side like something inside had moved wrong. The attending's responses had been texts, not calls. Monitor and report. Likely anxiety post-op. I'll be there for morning rounds, 0620. The chart told a different story. 2 weeks post-thoracic surgery for shrapnel removal, left anterior chest cavity still rebalancing air and pressure. The ranger's mother had finally gone home at midnight after 14 hours of vigil, her exhausted face dissolving into tears when Margaret promised she'd call if anything changed. Margaret had meant it. Margaret always meant it. What she hadn't promised was that anyone would listen. At 0415, she called again. This time the attending didn't text back. The monitor over room 304 showed the ranger's chest rising and falling with increasing effort, each breath becoming something he had to think about instead of something his body did automatically. Margaret watched from the doorway without entering. Following protocol, a nurse observes, documents, reports. A nurse does not intervene. A nurse asks permission. A nurse accepts that somewhere in the hospital hierarchy above her, a man with a medical degree and a billing spreadsheet makes the decisions about who goes home and who stays and how long they're allowed to keep breathing easily while they recover. She was writing the 0415 observations into the medical record when Dr. Hargrove appeared in the hallway like something summoned by her resistance to him. He was still wearing yesterday's cologne under the overlay of coffee and something else, something sharp that smelled like adrenaline and anger. His tie was loosened but his expression was locked tight, the look of a man who'd spent the night making phone calls and didn't appreciate that his directives were being questioned by a nurse he'd already disciplined. Discharge paperwork for 304. He didn't ask. He stated it like a command that had already been given and simply needed executing. Get it started now. We need that bed turned over for the afternoon admission list. Margaret's fingers stopped moving. The pen she was holding became a very heavy object. She kept her voice level, kept her eyes on the medical record, kept her body language exactly what it needed to be, compliant, almost submissive. His oxygen saturation is 94. Respiratory rate 22. He hasn't been stable for post-operative discharge since midnight. His mother signed the AMA waiver. Hargrove's voice had the rehearsed quality, the sound of words he'd decided on ahead of time and was now delivering. AMA, against medical advice. A legal document that meant the patient had decided to leave despite physician recommendation. Except Margaret had been in that room. She'd watched the ranger's mother's face when Margaret mentioned oxygen levels and discharge protocols. That wasn't the face of someone making an informed choice. That was the face of a woman being worn down by exhaustion and reassurance that everything would be fine, really, once he got home, really, he just needs rest at home where his mother could monitor him, really, the paperwork is just a formality. I didn't see that documentation, Margaret said. Hargrove stepped closer. His presence came with him, not the kind of physical threat that needed words, but the kind that used institutional weight instead, the weight of a man who knew he could call the licensing board, the weight of a man who controlled whether she worked in Houston or had to drive 2 hours to find a hospital that would hire her after he made calls. You will prepare the discharge papers. You will move that patient to the waiting area by 0600, and you will do it with a smile because you will not be the reason we miss our bed turnover quota. Do I need to document this conversation with the board? The threat wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. It was meant to settle into her shoulders and teach her something about what happened to nurses who didn't understand modern hospital economics. Margaret set down her pen and looked up. Their eyes met across a distance of 3 feet that felt like a chasm. She didn't blink. She didn't speak. She just looked at him with the kind of absolute stillness that comes from a person who has learned what it means to move only when movement matters. Hargrove was the first to look away, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he'd decided not to say. When he was gone, Margaret returned to the medical record. Her hands moved with the precision of someone documenting not just what was happening to the patient, but what was happening to her, what was happening to her conscience as it collided with the institutional machinery that ran Mercy General. She wrote the time. She wrote the vital signs. She wrote, attending physician called at 0130-0330 and 0415 regarding patient deterioration. Patient currently experiencing increased respiratory effort consistent with potential pneumothorax development. Clinical recommendation, maintain current monitoring, defer discharge until post-operative stability achieved. Nursing assessment, patient unsafe for discharge at this time. Somewhere in the hospital's legal department, that documentation would matter. Somewhere in whatever investigation might come later, those words would become evidence that she had seen what was happening and had documented it despite the pressure, despite the threat, despite knowing that Hargrove was already building the file that would eventually slide across a board member's desk with her name at the top. At 0615, the ranger's mother arrived in the pre-dawn darkness, her eyes red and her coffee cup shaking slightly in her hand. She stopped at the nurse's station where Margaret was preparing the shift change report. Is he okay to go home? The mother asked it like a question, but it was a plea. The doctor said it was fine, that he just needs rest, but I'm worried. I've been worried since yesterday when that other doctor was so angry, and I don't know if I'm being an overprotective mother or if something is actually wrong, and I need to know if my son is safe. Margaret looked at her. She looked at the red-rimmed eyes and the hands that were shaking and the mother who had sat in that room for 14 hours because her son had come back from Afghanistan missing 2 toes and with invisible injuries that didn't show up on X-rays. She looked at her and couldn't lie. What do you see when you look at him? Margaret asked quietly. The mother blinked. I see my son. Look closer. Watch his breathing. Watch how his ribs move. Watch his shoulders rise when they should stay still. Listen to him breathe. Really listen. The mother set down her coffee and moved to room 304, and Margaret watched from the doorway as the woman who had carried her son through childhood and into manhood and out the other side of a war began to see what Margaret had been seeing since 0100. The slight blue tint at the lips that nobody mentioned. The way the left side of his chest didn't expand as fully as the right. The small sound, almost a whistle, each time he inhaled. The mother turned back to Margaret with her hand over her mouth, and that was the moment when alarms began sounding from room 304, sudden and shrill, when the Ranger's oxygen saturation began its rapid descent into impossible numbers, when everything that Margaret had documented and reported and warned about began happening exactly as clinical medicine predicted it would, and she was already moving toward the room when Dr. Hargrove appeared from the opposite direction, his hand raised like a stop sign, his voice cutting through the alarm noise with the kind of authority that belonged in a courtroom, not a crisis. "Step back, Margaret. The code team is en route. You will not touch that patient." The alarm shrieked at 0630. Margaret heard it from the hallway, that particular scream that means oxygen falling, pressure dropping, systems failing. Room 304. She moved toward it without thinking, her body already running through the checklist her hands learned 20 years ago in sandstorms and rubble. Hargrove stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance like he owned the patient inside. "Step aside," Margaret said. "Absolutely not. That man is being discharged. His paperwork." The monitor beeped again. 72. Falling. The Ranger's lips were turning blue. His trachea visibly shifted left, the whole windpipe displaced by air accumulating in his chest cavity where it had no business being. Tension pneumothorax. A pocket of trapped pressure that would collapse his heart if nobody acted in the next 3 minutes. Margaret didn't ask permission again. She moved past Hargrove like he was furniture. His hand grabbed her arm. She turned her head just enough to lock eyes with him, that flat, empty stare that made grown men step back from the wrong wars, and he released her. The Ranger's mother was on her feet, crying. The monitor screamed. 70. 68. His eyes were rolling back, his body going limp, oxygen-starved brain shutting down all non-essential systems. Margaret was already opening the crash cart. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Second and third ribs. Midclavicular line. She didn't have time to wait for the attending who was still somewhere in the building, probably checking emails. She didn't have time to call anyone. Time had already run out 3 minutes ago. She found the spot. The space between his ribs where the needle would go, not the romantic place movies showed, not some dramatic angle, but the actual anatomical landmark that meant the difference between dead in 2 minutes and alive in 30 seconds. Her hands moved on their own, steady as surgical steel. Muscle memory older than her nursing license kicked in, older than her name now, reaching back to a desert base and a 6-year-old boy pulled from rubble by hands that couldn't hesitate then and wouldn't hesitate now. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping came immediately, that specific sound like pressure releasing from a tire, like the world taking its first breath after holding it too long. The sound of survival. The sound of physics and pressure and the difference between alive and not. 74. Climbing. 78. The Ranger gasped, his body convulsing as oxygen returned to his starved cells. 82. His eyes fluttered open, confused, gasping, alive. 87. The monitor steadied its rhythm. 94. Normal. Stable. The code team burst through the door like they'd been waiting for an engraved invitation, and Margaret stepped back, letting them have their moment, letting them pretend they'd been seconds away the whole time. They didn't ask how the needle got there. They didn't ask who decompressed the tension. They looked at the now stable monitor, at the Ranger breathing like a human being instead of a drowning man, and they did what code teams do, they adjusted parameters and checked tubes and acted like they'd orchestrated the whole thing. But the Ranger's eyes found her. Through the chaos of the code team, through the hands and voices and urgency, his gaze locked on Margaret's face with the intensity of someone who recognizes a ghost. Not confusion. Not gratitude exactly. Recognition. The kind of recognition that lives in the oldest part of the brain, the part that remembers who carried you out of hell. His lips formed a word. Margaret read it without hearing it, the shape of her name, or something like it, something that existed only in the classified files and the erased records and the part of her biography that had been officially dead for 20 years. She turned away. She had to turn away. The attending arrived, looking confused about why he hadn't been needed, and Margaret was already moving into the hallway where Hargrove stood with his face going through colors, first white, the color of someone watching the impossible, then red, the color of someone realizing his control just evaporated like morning frost. She didn't wait for him to speak. She walked past him down the corridor, her badge clipped to her scrubs catching the fluorescent light, the small rectangle of plastic that represented everything she'd built to stay invisible. Behind her, she heard Hargrove's phone coming out. She heard him dialing. She heard the tone of his voice shift into something desperate and sharp, the voice of a man who'd just watched his carefully constructed power structure develop a hairline fracture. She finished her rounds. She charted. She moved through the morning like every other shift, like her hands hadn't just performed a procedure that officially didn't exist, like her body hadn't just betrayed the whole architecture of her disappearance. The younger nurses watched her. The attending watched her. Nobody said anything, but the silence was heavy with meaning, with the understanding that something impossible had just happened in room 304 and nobody could quite explain it. By 0800, Hargrove's calls had borne fruit. The hospital board chairman called personally. The state nursing board had begun an inquiry based on an anonymous complaint about procedures performed outside scope of practice. The investigator he kept on retainer had delivered a file thick with fabricated documentation, complaints from staff Margaret had never encountered, incidents from shifts she'd never worked, a paper trail designed to make her look unstable, unreliable, dangerous. Security came at 3:41 p.m. Not escorted. Not gentle. They had a cardboard box for her belongings and a termination letter that cited patient safety violations, insubordination, and practicing medicine without a license. She'd had 17 years at Mercy General. They gave her 12 minutes to clear her locker. She didn't fight it. She couldn't fight it. Not because she didn't have the skills or the connections to bury Hargrove in his own cruelty, but because fighting meant explaining, and explaining meant surfacing, and surfacing meant the red folder at the Pentagon would get a phone call from Houston asking about a woman named Margaret Walsh who apparently performed emergency procedures like she was trained to do exactly that under exactly those circumstances. The ID badge went into the guard's hand with a plastic clatter. Her name fell into a box with 1,000 other badges, and Margaret Walsh the civilian nurse ceased to exist in the eyes of Mercy General Hospital. By 1700 hours, her termination was complete. By 1800 hours, she was sitting in the waiting room of the VA hospital 20 minutes away, surrounded by veterans in wheelchairs and on crutches and carrying invisible injuries that showed up in their eyes. She told the intake nurse she was having panic attacks. She sat in the waiting room with her hands folded in her lap, trying not to think about the ranger, trying not to think about what she'd done, trying not to think about the fact that she'd just destroyed 7 years of careful invisibility in 90 seconds because a disabled kid couldn't breathe. The shame was immense. The shame was the particular kind that comes from being among the warriors she'd once carried through fire while hiding like a coward in scrubs, pretending her greatest strength was learning how to take orders, learning how to be small, learning how to disappear. The shame was rock bottom. The shame was the thought that maybe she'd never get back up from this one. An ambulance pulled up outside. She heard the sirens cutting off, heard the doors opening, heard paramedics moving fast toward the emergency bay. She didn't look up. She was trying to breathe through the panic in her own chest, trying to remember why she'd ever thought she could live as someone ordinary. The waiting room doors burst open. A stretcher came through, moving fast. The patient was unconscious, critical condition, trauma alert being called through the PA system. Margaret didn't look until she heard the paramedics reporting vitals: male, approximately 55, shrapnel wounds, multiple lacerations, unresponsive, and something in that voice made her raise her head. The stretcher passed close enough that she saw his face. Dark eyes. Weathered skin. A face that had lived through violence and somehow survived it. For just a moment, he wasn't unconscious. His eyes opened. His gaze shifted left. It found Margaret sitting in the waiting room in her street clothes, no badge, no credentials, no identity. His eyes widened. His lips moved. He whispered something in Pashto, a language she hadn't heard in 20 years, a language that belonged to that part of her biography that had been erased. "The angel who spared me in Kandahar," he whispered. The waiting room went so quiet you could hear the rain outside, hammering the windows like artillery, like the sky was applauding something it shouldn't have been allowed to see. The waiting room fell silent. Nobody moved. The rain kept hammering the windows like it was trying to break through. Margaret's hands trembled. Not from fear. From restraint. From 20 years of burying muscle memory that was screaming to surface, screaming that this man in front of her, the one lying unconscious on the gurney they were wheeling past, shouldn't exist anymore. He had died in Kandahar. She had watched him die. And now his eyes were opening, fixing on her like a compass finding true north, and his voice came out in Pashto so quiet the waiting room had to lean in to hear the translation. The orderly whispered, "The angel who spared me in Kandahar." Margaret's jaw clenched. Once. Twice. Then she stood. The ranger from room 304 rolled his wheelchair into the waiting room at 6:04 p.m. His boots were on his lap. His breathing was steady, normal oxygen saturation, strong pulse, the kind of recovery that made no medical sense given the severity of his presentation 2 hours ago. He looked directly at Margaret and spoke 7 words that changed the room's temperature. "You never told me you were the senior chief petty officer who carried me out." She didn't answer. She couldn't. The composure that had held her together for 7 years of night shifts, 3 years of watching younger nurses gossip at lunch while she sat alone, 3 hours of Hargrove's escalating retaliation, that composure was fracturing like old ice. A man in navy dress blues appeared at the waiting room entrance. Not a doctor. Not a nurse. The bearing was wrong for hospitals. The precision was wrong. The way he moved through space as if the air itself had been ordered to part for him, that was military. Senior chief. Looked to be in his 60s. Scars on his hands visible even from 20 feet away. He carried a manila folder the color of old secrets. "Senior Chief Walsh," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even spoken loudly. But the waiting room responded like he'd shouted. Veterans straightened. A young mother pulled her daughter closer. The orderlies froze mid-motion with the Taliban commander's gurney. Margaret turned. Met his eyes. Said nothing. "I'm Commander James Mitchell, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. JSOC sent me." He opened the folder. His voice carried through the waiting room like a knife through silk. Navy Cross. 2 silver stars. Presidential Unit Citation. Operation Kandahar Extraction, March 15, 2004. 43 lives recovered. 43. 2 of those were children. 1 was 6 years old. 1 named Marcus, who kept a pair of worn boots by his hospital bed because he never stopped remembering the hands that carried him out of a collapsed compound when his father was already dead and shrapnel was turning the walls to dust. The ranger's mother appeared in the waiting room doorway, her hand over her mouth. "Your disciplinary file from Mercy General," Mitchell continued, "document 7 years of patient advocacy. 7 years of fighting discharge protocols that violated medical standards. 7 years of documented objections to early release decisions. Every single case you objected to? Medicaid. Every single case Hargrove overruled? Generated a secondary private insurance admission into the free bed." He turned the folder so Margaret could see it. "The FBI has been investigating his billing scheme for 8 months. Your file is the evidence trail. Your refusal to discharge that patient in room 304 was the tipping point. His retaliation was also the confession." An FBI agent stepped forward from behind Mitchell. Federal ID visible. Voice steady. "Dr. Hargrove's private investigator has provided recordings. 3 phone calls. 1 to the hospital board chairman at 1:11 p.m. 1 to the state nursing board at 2:03 p.m. 1 to the investigator himself at 2:15 p.m., instructing him to fabricate complaints about your scope of practice violation. Those recordings are now evidence in a federal fraud prosecution. The waiting room had stopped breathing. At Mercy General, 6 miles away, the board chairman's resignation letter was already in circulation through hospital email. At 6:45 p.m., FBI warrants were being served to Dr. Hargrove's office. His billing records. His communications with insurance case managers. His patterns of discharge overrides dating back for years. 12 patients. 12 Medicaid cases. 12 readmissions within 72 hours. 12 secondary private insurance admissions. The math was perfect. The crime was mathematical. Hargrove's private investigator provided the recordings within 30 minutes of the warrant service. Called his attorney. Called the FBI. Made a deal. Cooperating witnesses always talked fastest when they realized they were the only loose thread in someone else's noose. By 7:22 p.m., the state nursing board had not just reversed the complaint against Margaret Walsh. They had opened a formal investigation into Dr. Hargrove's pattern of forcing early discharges against documented nursing objections. They were subpoenaing every case file. Every discharge override. Every patient readmission. The pattern was clear enough that a first-year law student could prosecute it. At 8:15 p.m., a security guard walked down the administrative corridor of Mercy General. The same guard who had escorted Margaret from the building 6 hours earlier with her belongings in a cardboard box. He carried an identical box now. His footsteps echoed on the tile, boot steps, measured, deliberate. He knocked on Dr. Hargrove's office door. Once. Twice. The door opened. Hargrove's face was the color of wet concrete. "I believe you know the way out, Doctor," the guard said. His voice wasn't loud. Didn't need to be. The night shift nurses gathered in the corridor behind him heard every syllable. Watched as Hargrove's hands shook taking the box. Watched as his medical credentials, the ones that had meant everything, that had bought him a 4,200 square foot house in the woodlands and a boat slip at Kemah, were placed on his empty desk by the hospital's risk management director. "Your medical license is suspended pending trial," she said. Effective immediately. Margaret sat in the VA hospital waiting room while the universe recalibrated around her. The ranger's mother embraced her. The former Taliban commander, the one who whispered that she had spared him in Kandahar, extended his hand from his hospital bed with tears running down his face. "Mercy," he said in accented English. "You taught me Mercy has no uniform." The Navy SEAL team leader from JSOC read from her file like it was scripture, Operation Kandahar Extraction. March 2004. Compound collapse. 6 insurgents neutralized. 2 children extracted under fire. Your hands performed needle decompression in sandstorms that would have stopped most people from seeing. Your hands carried that 6-year-old ranger out of a building that was folding in on itself. The military record shows you died in that compound, Senior Chief. Your file was sealed. Your identity was erased. You were given a civilian life because that's what you asked for. He paused. You were given a chance to be invisible. And instead, Commander Mitchell said quietly, you became a nurse. You spent 7 years saving people one shift at a time. You documented every violation. You fought for every patient who was being discarded for profit. You became the evidence trail that ended a scheme that had hurt 47 patients. The rain hammered harder against the VA hospital windows. Margaret's hands were steady now. The trembling had stopped. The restraint had transformed into something clearer, not the tight compression of a secret held, but the release of a weight finally set down. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood in her Navy dress uniform at the Rangers' Medal ceremony. The wear on the uniform was visible. It had been stored for 20 years, but it hung on her shoulders like she'd worn it yesterday. The Ranger stood without his wheelchair for the first time since his injury. His breathing was clear. His oxygen saturation was normal. His boots, the worn pair that had sat beside his hospital bed, were placed in a shadow box beside Margaret's Navy cross. The citation reader's voice carried through the auditorium, for extraordinary heroism in direct support of combat operations in Afghanistan. The Ranger's mother found Margaret after the ceremony, embraced her, and whispered, "Thank you for coming back to save him again." Dr. Hargrove was teaching CPR at Houston Community College by October. $15 an hour. His medical license was suspended. His trial was scheduled for spring. His boat slip at Kemah had been repossessed. The house in the Woodlands was in foreclosure. The institutional power that had felt absolute, the phone calls to allies, the board connections, the insurance relationships, had evaporated the moment Margaret's documented patient care decisions became evidence instead of insubordination. Margaret accepted the Director of Emergency Nursing position at Mercy General that same month. Full authority over discharge decisions. Full protection against retaliation. The position had been created specifically for her. The hospital was still calculating how much the fraud scheme had cost them in readmissions, in liability, in reputation. At the reception following the ceremony, a young nurse approached Margaret nervously. Night shift. Probably in her 3rd year. The same age Margaret had been when she was carrying Rangers out of burning buildings. "How did you stay so calm?" the young nurse asked. "When he was attacking you? When he was humiliating you? How did you not break?" Margaret showed her a photograph. Blood-stained. Exhausted. A team of 6 operatives holding 2 small children extracted from a collapsed compound. The faces were partially obscured by dust and angle, but the posture was clear, a military. Special operations. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst that human beings can do to each other. True class, Margaret said, is what you do when the lights go out. The worn combat boots caught the light in their shadow box. Margaret's hands didn't tremble anymore. They were the hands of someone who had carried lives through fire twice now, once in combat, once in a hospital where nobody knew who was holding them. If this story hit you, you need to subscribe right now. Like this video. Comment with one word, what would you have done in Margaret's position? The algorithm needs to see engagement, and your comment tells YouTube that stories about quiet strength matter. Stories about hidden heroes matter. So hit subscribe. Hit like. And tell me, did Hargrove's punishment fit his crime, or did he deserve worse?